Hey everybody, welcome back to When Harry Met Board Games. Today I'm going to be teaching you how to play Marvel Champions. Marvel Champions is a cooperative living card game by Fantasy Flight Games with a Marvel theme. I'm going to teach you guys how to set the game up for your first play, and I'm also going to simulate a few turns to give you guys an idea as to the rules and the structure of the game. So the first thing we're going to be doing for setup is each player is going to select one identity card. That is their character or their hero who they're going to be playing through for the remainder of the game. Now the core set or the base game comes with 5 different characters you can choose from. We have Spider-Man, we have Captain Marvel, we have She-Hulk, we have Iron Man, and finally we have Black Panther. For the purposes of this video, I will be choosing to play as Spider-Man. Now, these identity cards are double-sided. So we see here Spider-Man, and on the reverse side here, we see his alter ego, which is Peter Parker. So this is a very big aspect of this game. Players are going to be alternating between their alter ego sides and their hero sides, depending on which is beneficial to them at the moment. And we'll explain more of that as the video goes on. Now, the identity card has lots of very important information, which I'll explain more as we play the game. We have some basic actions here and their stats. We have the thwart action, the attack action, and the defend action. And we see Spider-Man's corresponding stats for each of those basic actions. Also, each hero is going to have a special ability that's unique to him or to her on their superhero side. Also, the alter ego side does have one basic action, which is your recovery action. As you incur damage throughout the course of the game, you will be flipping over to alter ego side in order to trigger this recover action and heal your character by the number found on this stat here. Also, the alter egos usually have a special ability as well, which further incentivizes you to switch back to alter ego here and there in order to potentially benefit from this. On the bottom of the card, you see the hand size, and here it says that Peter Parker's hand size is 6. That means at the end of your turn, when you draw up to your maximum hand size, you will draw 6 cards to your hand as long as you are in Peter Parker form. However, you'll notice with these characters, more often than not, their hand size is smaller when they are in hero form. So that's something to factor in. You also see on the bottom of the card the hit points. You have 10 hit points for Spider-Man. And the different heroes have different amounts of HP according to their strength levels in superhero lore. Now, the first thing you're going to do in the beginning of the game is you're going to select your identity card. You're going to place it in its alter ego form. You're going to grab a health dial here, and you're going to set it to the number corresponding with the hit points printed on the bottom of the identity card. So in the case of Peter Parker here, he has 10 hit points. So we'll set this dial to 10, and we are done with the first step of setup. Now, if you were playing a multiplayer game, that is anywhere from 2 to 4 players, this game plays anywhere from 1 through 4. You can play it solo, but you could also have a team of champions go with you on these adventures to defeat the villains. If you are playing with more than one player, you would choose as a team who would get this starting player marker. And basically that means that for the first round of the game, this player would be first in turn order. Now, at the end of a round, that is a player phase and a villain phase, and we'll talk more about the different phases of the game. At the end of the round, the player would pass the first player marker to the next player in clockwise order. So from round to round, it's going to alternate as to who is first in turn order. Now, each character also has other cards that come with their toolkit. They have their signature cards, which are specific to them. They also have the nemesis. Each superhero has a rival who they have to watch out for. In the case of Peter Parker Spider-Man, we have Vulture here. Now, with the Nemesis cards, which usually consist of 4 or 5 cards, you're going to take them and you're going to set them aside for now. For the most part, you will not have to deal with them. There are cards that you will encounter throughout the course of the game that might potentially cause your Nemesis cards to enter the game. Each player also has an obligation card. Here for Peter Parker, we have this eviction notice, and this basically represents some challenge that the character has in their own personal life, not just their superhero life, that they have to watch out for and overcome as they're trying to defeat villains and bad guys. For the time being, we're going to set this apart. We're going to set this aside, but this will be included in the encounter deck by the beginning of the game. Now that we've set these cards aside, we would work on constructing our decks. This is a game that's all about deck construction or building of the decks. The core set does have some pre-constructed decks, in particular for Peter Parker, Spider-Man, and for Captain Marvel, Carol Danvers as well. You can play with those decks for your first couple games. As you get more comfortable with the game, you have deck customization options. You can find out more about the rules as far as the deck customization limits. But early on, it's to your advantage to figure out the game with the pre-constructed decks. Now, if you are building a deck or constructing a deck for yourself, the first thing you would have to decide is which of the 4 aspects you're going to play with. The core game comes with 4 aspects, which basically represent the specialties. Where will your character specialize in? We have the aggression aspect, which is all about being confrontational and combat oriented. It's all about dealing damage to the villain and his or her minions. We have the justice aspect, which is more about thwarting the schemes of the villain. We also have the protection aspect, which is about protecting, defending your character and your teammates and keeping them healthy. And finally, we have the leadership aspect, which is about controlling allies, leading a group of allies. Now, no matter which aspect you have, you will have allies built into your deck. But with the leadership aspect, that kind of becomes your specialty. For the purposes of this video, we'll be choosing Peter Parker, Spider-Man here, playing with the aggression aspect. And after you choose your aspect and add some cards from that aspect to go along with your signature cards specific to your hero, after that, you can fill out your deck with some of these gray basic cards. These are generic cards that do a little bit of everything. You do not get as much bang for your buck with the basic cards as you do with your aspect specific cards, or definitely not your signature cards. So you definitely don't want to have too many of these, but sometimes they might help cover some weaknesses or some holes that are obvious in your character and in your deck. After you've chosen all of these cards, you're going to build your deck. You're going to make sure that they fall within the confines or within the range of 40 to 50 cards. You cannot have any fewer than 40 cards, but you also cannot have any more than 50. And once you decide on all the cards that are going to make up your particular hero deck, you can shuffle them all together. And then we are done as far as the hero side of the setup. Now we're going to show you how to set up the villain or the scenario that the heroes are going to be encountering. Now the core set comes with 3 different villains or scenarios you can play through. You have Rhino, you have Claw, and you have Ultron. It is recommended and strongly suggested that for your first few games, you play against Rhino. He would represent an easier challenge as opposed to Claw, who would be more on the intermediate side of things, and Ultron, who's more on the difficult side of things. So the first thing you would do is you would grab the villain cards, and basically the villains have their own cards, and each villain will have, or most villains at least, will have a 1, a 2, and a 3, representing different stages or different levels. And as you advance through these stages and levels, they get more difficult. We see on the bottom here, not only do we see a number here corresponding with the name of this scenario, Rhino, it'll also specify how many cards exactly are found in this scenario. So that's very useful information for housekeeping reasons. We also see here the hit points. This here says 14, and we see an icon here, which represents players. Basically, he's going to have 14 hit points, at least at stage 1, per player. So if you're only playing 1 player, he's going to have 14 hit points. If you're playing with 2 players, he's going to have 28 hit points, and so on and so forth. Now, players are going to choose what level of difficulty they want to play. And there are 2 basic levels of difficulty. You have your standard difficulty and you have your expert difficulty. If you are playing standard, you're simply going to choose the 1 and 2 stage and set aside the 3. It will not be used for a standard game. However, if you were playing expert, you would take the level 1 or the stage 1 card and set that aside, and you would start the game with stage 2 and ultimately to stage 3. Because what happens in this game is you have to defeat the villain twice. First, you have to defeat them at the first stage, and then you have to defeat them at the second stage. So for the purposes of this video, we're going to be simulating a solo game. We're going to set these cards down right here. The stage 1 right here. The stage 2 will be right beneath it. I like to just keep it beneath it. So once I defeat one stage, I simply remove it and reveal the second level card. Some people set aside their second stage card, but that's my personal preference. So we have this card here. We're going to grab the villain health dial here, and we're going to set it to 14 per player. There's only going to be one player, so he's going to have 14 HP. And once we knock him down to 0, then we will reveal the second stage of Rhino. So now that we have selected our villain and we have set their hit points, we are going to set up their schemes. Every villain has a scheme, a main scheme. There's also additional side schemes, they're called, but we'll see here that this here has the keywords main scheme. And a villain's main scheme usually has anywhere from 1 to 3 different levels to it. So as the scheme progresses, you reveal the second level and the third level. In the case of Rhino, he only has one level of scheme, and that comes with pros and cons. There are some challenges to when a villain only has one scheme. You have to be more careful because usually whatever their last stage of their scheme is, it usually has these words printed on the bottom, and it says, if this stage is completed, the players lose the game. So with a villain who only has one level to their scheme, you have less room for error. So we have this scheme here, and if you look at the 1A side, you always have a 1A and a 1B, a 2A and a 2B, and so on and so forth, depending on how many levels there are to the scheme. It tells us the contents. It tells us that we need Rhino 1 and Rhino 2 if we're going to play a standard game, and we already have set that up. But it also tells us what additional cards are going to comprise his encounter deck. So first of all, we have the Rhino encounter cards right here. And as I mentioned earlier, on the bottom of these cards, you have numbers here to indicate how many cards there are in this encounter, so you can be exactly sure that you have all the cards necessary for the given encounter. So it also tells us here on this scheme card that we need a standard encounter set. And basically, this game comes with these standard encounter sets and this expert encounter set. Now, if you're playing expert, you will still include these standard cards in your encounter deck. However, you would also shuffle these additional 3 expert level cards into your encounter deck, which are a little bit more interesting and certainly a lot more difficult. But we are simply playing a standard game against Rhino Stage 1 and Rhino Stage 2. So we're only going to include these standard cards into the encounter deck. Finally, the main scheme here tells us that we can add one modular encounter set. And that's one of the advantages of Marvel Champions. It's a very modular game. There are lots of different variant modular sets that players can mix and match to their heart's content. However, the schemes will usually recommend one. And in this case, it's recommended that we add the Bomb Scare modular set to the encounter deck. And here we have the Bomb Scare, just like all other encounter cards. We have the number here so you can know exactly how many there are. There are 6 cards in the Bomb Scare encounter set. And we will add this to the encounter deck. And finally, we will resolve any setup text. Usually the encounters and sometimes even the heroes have setup text, things that you will activate, particularly during the setup phases of the game. And here it tells us that for setup, all we have to do is simply advance to stage 1B. So we're going to flip this over get to stage 1B. And sometimes these encounters or these schemes, these main schemes, might have a when revealed effect. And if they had such an effect, this would be the time when they would resolve. However, for Rhino here, his main scheme, the break-in, we just have some flavor text. Rhino is trying to smash through the facility wall and steal a shipment of vibranium. You must stop him. And again, finally, in bold, as I mentioned earlier, it tells us that if this stage is completed, the players lose the game. Now here on the upper right hand corner, we see the number 7 and again the icon for players. This is telling us that if Rhino can advance this scheme with 7 threat per player, so in the case of a solo game, just 7, in the case of 2 players, it would be 14, and so on and so forth. If he can meet or exceed that threshold at any point in the game, then he's completed this scheme, and we have lost the game if this stage is ever completed. So that's something we have to try to prevent at all costs. So there are no setup abilities that are special to this scheme. There are no when revealed abilities that are special to the scheme. So now finally, the last thing we will do is we will shuffle our encounter deck. That includes the Rhino encounter cards, it includes the standard encounter sets, and it includes the modular bomb scare sets. Now we would finally add each hero's obligation card. And remember, each hero has at least one, in some cases multiple, obligation cards specific to their alter ego and something that's going on in their alter ego's personal life. Apparently for Peter Parker, he's having a hard time paying his rent. So here we go. We're going to add this as the final card to the encounter deck. And after you have shuffled your encounter deck, you can move on to the final steps of the setup. So the last thing we will do for setup is we will draw cards from our hero decks equal to your alter ego side. You will always begin the game in alter ego. So your opening hand size is equal to the hand size on the alter ego side of your card. Keep in mind that your hero side will always have, or quite often will have, a different hand size, usually smaller. So we will draw cards equal to the hand size. So Peter Parker's hand size is 6. We will draw the first 6 cards. And I have this Relentless Assault, this Aunt May support card. You have different card types represented in the game. Here we have a little bit of everything. We have an event. These are one-time actions that you trigger. You pay their cost. Their cost is on the upper left-hand corner, usually ranging between 0 to 6. Very rarely does it get that high. More often than not, it's 0 to 3. But you do have cost 4 cards that pop up quite often. So your events, again, are cards that you pay their amount. You activate their action one time. Support cards are usually places or items or sometimes even personas, characters like Aunt May, non-hero specific characters who will stay in your player area once you pay their cost. They will stay in your tableau. And basically, you'll be able to benefit from their particular action going forward throughout the course of the game. As you can see here, Aunt May here has an alter ego action. That means in order to activate this ability, not only have you had to already have her paid for her and have her in your player area, but you got to be in alter ego form in order to activate this ability. But it's a really good one because it heals Peter Parker a lot. We also have these resource cards. These are usually cards that are good to have a few in your deck because they generate additional resources, because your cards themselves, they are going to be the resource. And we see here on the lower left-hand corner, we have 3 basic resource types. We have your energy resource, your physical resource. You also have your mental resource, which is represented by this icon here. We don't see any here in our opening hand, but we do have this little star here, which represents the wild resource, which means it counts for any of these. Sometimes you have cards that need to be paid by a particular type of resource in order for you to be able to pay its cost, or in order for you to be able to benefit from an additional bonus for that particular card. So this is a resource card, the Power of Aggression. In particular, it'll help us double the number of resources it generates for aggression cards. Remember, you have your aggression aspect. In my case, I have aggression. You have different aspects you could choose from. However, this will only count as a single wild resource when paying for anything else. Like, for example, a Spider-Man signature card will not be benefited with a double resource from from this power of aggression. We also have upgrades. Upgrades are like, they're very much like support cards in the sense that you pay them, they stay in your player area, and you benefit from them long term. Sometimes your upgrades are attachments that are attached to minions, like in the case of Spider Tracer, so they might be a little bit less permanent in nature. Sometimes you have upgrades that are attached to the schemes or to the villains. However, for the most part, upgrades stay in your player area and you'll be able to benefit from them long term unless some other card effect makes you discard them. Now, the difference between upgrade and support is that for purposes of game text that refers to you, when the game refers to you, they're referring to your identity. That is your alter ego or your hero side. It's referring to the events that you play. I mentioned we have event cards, and it's also referring to your upgrades. Now, a support card does not count as you. And an ally, which is a different card type, which represents different hero friends that are helping and aiding the main heroes in their quest to defeat the villains. The allies and the support cards do not count as you. So whenever the game text refers to you, you've got to keep in mind that that refers to the hero's identity card, the hero's played event cards, and the hero's played upgrade cards. So upgrades are more valuable than support cards in that sense and usually give you more bang for your buck. All right, so we have the Spider Tracer support upgrade card. We have the support. We have an additional upgrade here, which is webbed up. So this is a pretty good hand of cards. Now, this is the time during the setup to decide whether or not you want to resolve a mulligan. And in this game, when you take a mulligan, basically you're unhappy, you're unsatisfied with your opening hand, you don't simply discard cards or shuffle them back into your deck. You discard cards, they remain in your discard pile, which is something to keep in mind because every time you run through your hero deck, there will be a penalty. The game will force you to draw an encounter card as a consequence for running through your hero deck. So you do not want to run through your hero deck unnecessarily so. However, sometimes, quite often, taking a mulligan to get to a real good card that you know will be helpful for your early setup or your early strategy, it might be worth it. As you're getting to know the game, you'll become more familiar with it and you'll know when is the right time to pull the trigger as far as those kind of things. Early on in your experience, you're really just getting familiar with your hero cards, your deck, and you don't necessarily know which cards you are looking for. So for this video, I am not going to take a mulligan, but if you wanted to take a mulligan, you can discard as many of these cards as you wish, and you could draw a few more to replace them or up to your hand size. Now, me personally, when I do take a mulligan, I usually do about 3 cards because I realize that even if I don't like all 6 of my cards, some of them are just going to be resources for me anyhow. You're not going to play all your cards because, as I mentioned, the resources that you are going to use to pay the cost of these cards are the very same cards in your hand. So you're usually going to have 2 or 3 really good cards you might want to play, but quite often you're only going to be able to play 1 or 2 of them. So I will not resolve a mulligan, but this would be the time in the setup where I would be able to do so. Now, finally, after you've looked at your opening hand and have decided whether or not you want to resolve a mulligan, this is the point in the game where you would resolve any setup abilities that your hero character has. I already mentioned the setup abilities on the villains and on the villain main schemes, but sometimes the heroes have a setup ability on their alter ego side, and this would be the time where you would resolve that. Quite often, it usually lets them start the game or search your deck with an additional particular card that's very important to that character. In the case of Peter Parker Spider-Man, we do not have any setup abilities. So with that being said, we are actually ready to begin the game. I did forget to mention that you should set aside all the special tokens that the game comes with. I have them mostly off screen here, but you have your damage tokens here, which are going to be used to represent damage on your allies and on the villains' minions, because for your main characters, your heroes and your villains, you're going to have these hit point dials or these health dials to keep track of that. But for some of the less significant characters, you'll be keeping track of their health and their damage through these health tokens or these damage tokens. You also have these yellow threat tokens, which will represent the threat on the schemes as the villains scheme and advanced their plots. We also have these green multi-purpose tokens. There's lots of cards that are going to tell you that when you play them, you're going to place a certain amount of tokens. Each token grants you a particular action. And these are generic, no matter what. The different cards will have a thematic description of what those actions are. But if it's not something that's damage or threat related, you're always going to use these green tokens to represent those particular actions that you can trigger on these different cards. So now we're going to go through our first round of play to show you how the game goes. Each round is divided into two phases. You have your player phase, where the different heroes or characters will take their actions in turn order. And then after all the players are done with their turn, we move on to the villain phase. So now I'll show you what the player phase looks like. So for starters, at the beginning of the game, you want to be well acquainted with what your character does when they are in alter ego form. In particular, Peter Parker here has this scientist ability. It's a resource ability. So that bold text is letting you already know where this will help you. He can generate a mental resource once per round. So basically, he can help you pay for cards without having to spend as many of your resources from your actual hand, because basically he will grant you a one card discount or a one resource discount thanks to the fact that he generates this mental resource. Also, for any particular cards, any particular events that are benefited from a particular mental resource, this would come in very handy. Quite often you have actions that are triggered and they have an additional cost, which is a specific type of resource. And sometimes you might not have the resource in your hand at the right moment, but this could be very, very helpful as long as it's an action that you can take in alter ego form. And that's something very important to keep in mind. Quite often your cards have words on them that say action. Action means that it's something you can do whether you are in alter ego or in hero form. However, quite often you will see actions that say hero action. In order to take these actions, you need to be in hero form. And the same goes with alter ego actions. In order to take those, you need to be in alter ego form. So now I know that the first card I buy, I could get a one resource discount. So now, I have this really cool attack action. It's not relevant because this here tells me that I could deal 5 damage to a minion. Well, there is no minion in play. And to activate an event or an action, there has to be an eligible target available. So that's something to keep in mind. You cannot just activate an event because you want to activate an event. There actually has to be a legitimate way to capitalize from it. And there is no minion in play, so I will not be able to do that. I might just set up Aunt May here for free. She only costs 1, so I could use that same science resource. I'll put her here beside me, and she's going to be useful. So whenever I take damage and I revert back to alter ego form, I can use Aunt May in order to heal up more quickly, because Spider-Man has a recover stat of only 3. That means each time I activate this ability, I'll only be able to recover 3 health. And sometimes that might not be enough. So that is really good. I did that already. Now let's see what else I want to do. At this point, I'm going to flip over from alter ego to hero form. And this is a very important part of the game. It's deciding when to flip into hero form and when to flip back into alter ego form. And here's the thing. You only get 1 free change of form per turn or per round. So you do not want to do that without thinking. You want to strategize and you want to map out what you're going to do for the rest of the turn, because once you flip over to the other side, you are done. Now, this is a cooperative solo game, so I'm pretty generous with myself as far as walking things back, as long as no new information has been revealed. But again, you do want to think through when you switch over from alter ego to hero form and vice versa. Now, there are some actions and hero-specific cards and abilities that allow you to break the rule of only switching form 1 time. But in general, players get 1 free change of form per round. Now that I'm in hero form, I can look at Spider-Man's stats here. And by the way, there's no specific order in which you have to do the actions that you take. Part of the game is figuring out which order is optimal for you, when to do what, when to switch over from hero form to alter ego and vice versa, when to attack or when to scheme, when to play an event, when to trigger the action of an upgrade or a support card. These are things that you can choose in whatever order makes most sense for you. But right now, I just want to look at the different basic stats. These here are referred to as basic actions. So whenever you read the phrase basic actions in a card, it's referring to your thwart, your attack, and your defense ability of your hero card. And basically, every time you want to activate one of these basic actions, you have to exhaust your hero card or your identity card, rotate them 90 degrees to indicate that this has already been used. Now, if your hero card has any additional abilities printed on their hero card or their identity card, you do not need to exhaust to activate those abilities unless the text specifically indicates that you do. In the case of Spider-Man, his ability is an interrupt. That means he would interrupt a particular action. In this case, it's the villain initiating an attack against you, and he would draw one card. So before the villain would be able to continue his attack action, Spider-Man here would be able to draw a card. Now, this is a defense stat. This is something that would happen during the villain phase, so it's irrelevant for the player phase. So Spider-Man has a thwart stat of 1. There is currently no threat on the main scheme, so I will not use his thwart action. Also, it doesn't really give me much bang for my buck because, as you can see, he has a better attack stat. So instead, I'm going to exhaust Spider-Man here to deal 2 damage to an enemy. There are no minions. However, if there were, I could choose to attack a minion, but I'm going to go for the main villain, Rhino, right here. And I'm going to take his health dial here and lower him by 14, from 14 down by 2 to 12. Now I'm going to see what else I can do. I do have this very useful Power of Aggression. I have this Spider Tracer and this Relentless Assault, which are both very useful cards if there were any minions in play. More often than not, there are no minions at the opening of the game. There are some villains that do, for their setup, include minions already engaged with the players, but this is not the case with Rhino. So I'm going to actually use one of these 2 cards. I think I'm going to use the Spider Tracer here, along with the Power of Aggression, to generate 3 resources. We have this 1 energy resource, and then we have the Power of Aggression, which will generate 2 resources as long as it's for another aggression card. And I will pay for this TAC team card. And this is a support card. So again, I mentioned earlier, support cards do not count as you. I'll just place these 2 spent resources in my discard pile. And it says here that we're going to use 3 attack counters. So I mentioned how quite often these cards have counters that you place on them, and this is exactly when you would take these green colored tokens and you would place them on top of that card, and these represent attack counters. And basically it tells us here that I could do an action, so it doesn't matter if I'm in hero or alter ego form. I can exhaust TAC team and remove 1 attack counter, and I could deal 2 damage to an enemy. And this is a really cool card because not only does it deal 2 damage, which is a solid amount of damage, but it says that it deals 2 damage, but it doesn't specify that it's an attack card. And we'll talk more about that later on. But sometimes there are cards that are played from the encounter deck or minions that are engaged with the players that will prevent the hero and all the cards that they control, their events, their upgrades, and their supports, from attacking. And this is a way around it because whenever you have a card that does not have the attack trait on it, or it does not say the words attack, instead it says deal damage, that is a way around, that's a loophole around these limitations of not being able to attack. So I have the TAC team, I'm going to exhaust them, and I'm going to remove 1 of these counters in order to deal an enemy 2 damage. And again, there are no minions engaged with me, so I don't really have a choice, but who better to attack than the main villain, since that is the goal of the game. So I will knock him down by 2, and he's now at 10 hit points. And he's only 10 away from defeating the first stage and moving on to the second stage. Now, I will say this video is just a tutorial as far as the rules, but little quick advice for strategy. Sometimes you do not want to beat the first stage of the villain too quickly because, again, they rev up in subsequent stages and they become very, very powerful. And early on, you might not have the necessary tools and the necessary engine to endure their stronger assaults. So that is pretty much it for my turn because I have these two cards and I cannot afford them. I have no other action that I can take based on my identity card or any of the other supports or upgrades in my player area. So I am done with my turn. And now, if we were playing a multiplayer game, the next player in clockwise order would take their turn. Now, after every player around the table has taken their turn and exhausted all possible actions, or at least the ones that they want to take, we then proceed to the end of player phase. And in this phase, in player order, each player may discard any number of cards in their hand. So again, if you want to speed up getting to some of the more specific cards that you're looking for as you build your deck and you get more familiar with the strategy, there may be cards that you're specifically looking for. If you want to go through these cards quicker in order to get to them, you do have the option of discarding as many cards from your remaining hand as you would like. Again, keep in mind that once you run through this deck, and every time you run through your hero deck, you will be dealt an additional encounter card, and we'll talk more about encounter cards shortly. The point is that there is a little bit of a consequence for speeding through your deck, but sometimes the cards you're looking for might be worth it. I will discard these two cards because, in particular, Relentless Assault, at the time being, I don't think it might have to be an issue, even though there are potential minions that might get engaged with me between now and the beginning of my next turn. So now I am done with that. Each player around the table would also have their opportunity to discard as many cards as they want from their hand. And then, after every player has made their decision as to how many or if they want to discard any cards at all, each player simultaneously will draw cards from their hero deck equal to their current hand size. And as I mentioned earlier, Spider-Man here, when he's in Spider-Man in hero form, his hand size is 5. So I will draw 5 cards. I have an ally, so that's another card type that I haven't talked about yet. These are probably the most valuable card types in the game because you can put them down and they can do so many things for you. Just like your hero, they can thwart for you, they can attack for you. Very often they have a special ability that triggers when they first enter into the game, and also they can defend against you against the attacks of minions and villains. So these are very valuable characters. They also have hit points just like your main character and the villain and the minions that are in the encounter deck. So this is how much damage they can sustain before they are discarded into your discard pile. So I have Tigra here. I have another Relentless Assault, so I really don't regret discarding the first one. I have another ally here, Mockingbird. And finally, I have Backflip. So all the players would draw back up to their hand size. And then again, simultaneously, each player would ready all their cards. So all those cards that you exhausted during your turn, after having taken their actions, you would ready them up. And now we are done with the player phase. Now we're going to move on to the villain phase. And the first thing that takes place in the villain phase is you place threat on the main scheme. And basically we have this stat here on the bottom. See this number here? It actually represents how much threat each scheme begins with. Most schemes, or many schemes at least, start the game with 0 threat. But there are schemes that from the very get-go already have some threat tokens placed on them. But here, this little number here in this triangular or house-shaped icon here, it says 1, and again, it has the symbol for players. So 1 per player. So each round at the beginning of the villain phase, you're going to accelerate the scheme by 1 threat per player. In this case, there's only 1 player, and that's me. So we're going to add 1 token to the main scheme. After we have placed threat on the main scheme, the second part of the villain phase is their activation. So the villain will activate once per player. So if there are 3 players, there will be 3 activations. In this case, there's only 1 player, so there will only be 1 activation. And what the villain does with their activation depends on what side of the identity each player is on. So they're going to activate each of these activations separately. So the first thing in player order, right now, Spider-Man's the only player. If we were playing multiple people, whoever had the start player token, the villain would activate against them first. Now, if your character is in alter ego form, the villain is going to scheme. And each villain has a scheme stat represented here in this blue symbol here. And each villain also has an attack stat right here in the red. And as we can see, Rhino is much more effective at attacking than he is at scheming. So villains always have their strengths and their weaknesses. So if he was in alter ego form, he would be scheming. However, Peter Parker is not out and about taking photographs. Instead, Spider-Man is taking care of business. So if the character, the player, is in hero form, instead of scheming, the villain's activation will be an attack. Now, if you were playing a multiplayer game and some heroes were in alter ego form and other heroes were in hero form, again, Rhino or the villain would resolve each of those activations one at a time, depending on the form that your character is in. So with one character, he might be scheming, and with another character, he might be attacking. So he is going to attack Spider-Man. Now that I know that he's attacking Spider-Man, he is initiating the attack, and Spider-Man can trigger his spider sense ability, which actually interrupts this stage of Rhino's action. It doesn't mean that he's not going to carry through it, but before we continue, Spider-Man's going to interrupt it for a brief moment in order to activate this ability, which tells us that he can draw 1 card. So I will draw 1 card. It's a very useful ability that Spider-Man has. I drew this double resource. It's a double strength resource in particular. And now, usually when the villain attacks you, quite often, almost always, you will draw 1 or more boost cards. And the boost cards are basically just the cards from the top of the deck, from the encounter deck. Later on, when you play them, they represent an encounter card. Right now, they simply represent a boost to the character's main stats. So if the villain were doing a scheme activation, you would also draw a boost card. So unless the game text or the card text specifies otherwise, every time the villain takes an activation, whether it be scheming or attack, whenever you see those words, attack, scheming, or activates, you are always going to draw a boost card for the villain. So we have this card here, and before we reveal this boost card, the player has to make the decision as to what they're going to do with this attack. Now, the player could choose to just take the attack, and they will take the full brunt of the blow and have that damage taken or removed, that health removed from their health dial here. So the hero can choose to just take all of this damage, which we know will be at least 2, plus any boost icons here that will enhance the attack, and a card can have, typically speaking, from 0 to 4 boost icons. So the range, the potential range of his damage can be anywhere from 2 to 6. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, in the base game, in the core set, more often than not, the different encounter cards don't have more than 2 or 3 boost icons. But that's something to keep in mind. You do not know the full range, the full extent of the damage until this card is revealed, but you have to make your decision first. Now, Spider-Man can also choose to defend, and each hero has a defense stat, and some characters have better defense stats than others. Spider-Man has a really good defense stat. He has a defense stat of 3. That means if I choose to defend, once I tally up all the potential damage that Rhino would have done, I would subtract that by 3, and that's how much actual damage Spider-Man would incur. So that's another option. Now, if I had allies, as I mentioned earlier, one of the most useful things that ally can do is they can defend an attack. Now, if an ally was in play already, I could choose to defend with the ally. Now, when an ally defends an attack against a villain, more often than not, that means the ally is going to be knocked out, because usually allies have a health of 2 or 3, occasionally 4 or 5, but the villains tend to hit harder than the minions and the other enemies in this game. So more often than not, these allies would go away, but at least they would protect your character, and also they would prevent you from having to exhaust your character, because in order to defend with Spider-Man, I would have to exhaust him. And if I exhaust him, that means unless I have an ability that allows me to ready sometime before or during my next turn, Spider-Man will not be able to take his basic actions, that is his thwart and his attack. As I mentioned, every time you take these basic actions, you have to exhaust your character, and you do not get a free ready of your character at the end of the villain phase. The only time that you're allowed to freely ready your character is at the end of the player phase. So do you want to defend, prevent that damage, but at the expense of not being able to take your basic actions? Now, again, you could still do any additional ability printed in the text box here. You would still be able to play cards and events and upgrades and supports to your heart's content, but you would not be able to take these basic actions if Spider-Man were exhausted. Now, I do not have an ally, and I do not want to defend because I have this backflip card. And sometimes you have these defense cards. Some heroes have them in their toolkit. One of the aspects, the protection aspect, has plenty of them. And sometimes you might want to play these defense cards in response to something that's happening. And I will. I will do this interrupt. First of all, I will reveal this boost card here, which we would look on the bottom right-hand corner here for these red arrow-shaped icons. And each of those arrow-shaped icons would have added an additional 1 damage to Rhino's attack. However, we were very lucky. This card here has no icons, no boost icons, so it's not going to add a single thing. So it's only going to be 2 damage. So now that I know that it's only going to be 2 damage, I might actually want to save my backflip, because this is a really good card for a more powerful attack. Let's say Rhino was dealing me 4 or 5 damage. I would have played this card without even flinching, without even thinking about it. But I'm actually going to decide to take that damage. I will decrease my health dial here by 2. Spider-Man now has 8 health. I'm not so concerned because Spider-Man has some pretty good defense cards already in hand. And again, as I mentioned early, he has an above average defense stat here of 3. So that's it. The villain has activated against me. So we already had the first part of the villain phase, which is the placement of the threat. We had the second part of the villain phase, which was the villain activating against me. If there were other players around the table, the villain would activate against them according to the side they are on currently on their identity card. Which form are they in? Are they in alter ego? Then the villain would scheme. Or are they in hero form? Then the villain would attack them. And they, if they are being attacked, would be confronted with the same decisions as I was. Do they defend with their character? Do they take the full brunt of the hit? Do they play a defense card? Or if they have an ally in their player area, do they choose to sacrifice that ally in order to protect their hero? Now, once the villain is done with the activation phase, the villain or the villain phase moves on to the encounter part of the phase, where basically each player is going to be dealt 1 face down encounter card. Now, after each player has been dealt their face down encounter card, in turn order, each player will reveal and resolve their encounters. And in this case, I've got this Sandman minion, and he's a pretty strong guy with some pretty good health here, and he has this toughness keyword. And in the core set, they do you the favor of, in parentheses, elaborating as to what these keywords mean. So this toughness one here means that this character enters play with a tough status card. So we will place him here near my player area. He is engaged with Spider-Man, always the player who was dealt the encounter card. If it's a minion, more often than not, that's the player who that minion will engage with. And we're going to give him this tough status card. The game does come with these status cards to represent some of the different statuses, like being stunned or being confused, which would prevent you from attacking and thwarting, or the villain from attacking and scheming, respectively. So Sandman here has this tough status card. Now, the tough status card tells us exactly what it does. It says here, the next time this character would take any amount of damage, discard this tough status card instead. So the next time I hit him damage, it's a waste of time other than getting rid of that tough status card. So I probably do not want to invest a really powerful attack in getting rid of that card. Now, there were other players playing. They too, in turn order, would reveal and resolve their encounter cards. And finally, after all players have resolved their encounter cards, again, if we were playing with more than one player, the current starting player would pass the starting player marker to the next player in clockwise order. And that would be the end of the villain phase. And then we would proceed to another hero phase with a new starting player. I am going to go through one more rapid fire hero phase or player phase and a rapid fire villain phase to give you guys a little bit more of an idea as to how the game's played. So I have these 6 cards now. Remember, Spider-Man has a hand size of 5, but because I triggered my spider sensibility and drew a card after having an attack initiated against me by Rhino, I do have these cards here. I have a lot of options here. I think I'm going to use this double strength resource along with this chase them down to play Mockingbird. And Mockingbird is a pretty useful ally. She's pretty weak with her stats. She only thwarts for 1 and attacks for 1, but she has this response that after she enters play, she can stun an enemy. So I'll put her here. She's basically gonna help me fend off the different bad guys. Quite often I'm kind of limited in space, but I usually have my allies somewhere in between my villain or the villains and myself. But in this case, I'm just going to place this card here. And as I mentioned, as soon as she enters play, she will stun a character, an enemy. So I will take the stun status, choose an enemy to place it on. I'm going to choose Rhino because even though Sandman has a stronger basic value of attack at 3, Rhino will always draw an encounter card or a boost card whenever he activates. So his potential for damage is greater than Sandman. So this is why Mockingbird is so useful, because you can use her immediately to stun an enemy. You can get a few weak activations from her, and eventually when you're ready to part ways with her, you can use her as a defender to protect your hero. Now, I do have these additional cards. I could choose to keep my backflip, and I was going to go that route, but now that I have Rhino stunned, I figured, you know what? Instead, I got to get rid of this tough status card. So I'm going to use Spider-Man's basic activation. As I mentioned earlier, there's no particular order in which you have to carry out your actions. The only thing you really have to keep in mind is that you only get one opportunity to flip and change forms from hero to alter ego or vice versa. That's really it. Aside from that, you do not need to trigger your actions in any specific order. So I'm going to choose to do my basic attack first. I will exhaust Spider-Man, and this will get rid of this tough status card. So Sandman is no longer tough. Now I will choose to use this backflip and Tigra. I will use them as resources, play them here in my discard pile, in order to play this event, this Relentless Assault. And this tells me that I can deal 5 damage to a minion. And that is the card type for these enemies that are not the villains. They are the minions. And it tells us here that if I paid for this card using a fist resource, that means at least one of the resources I used was a fist resource. And this here, this backflip card, is a fist resource. Then I get to benefit from this bonus ability, and it tells me that this attack will gain overkill. And again, the base game is very user friendly, and it specifies what overkill means. It means that any excess damage from this attack is dealt to the villain, and 5 damage is more than enough for Sandman, who only has 4 HP. So 5 minus 4 equals 1, so there will be 1 excess damage. I will place Sandman here in the discard pile, and I will deal that 1 excess damage to Rhino over here, and now he is down to 9 health. Now I still have Mockingbird here, who I have not activated. Now you want to watch out for Rhino's main scheme, because it has a very low threshold, and believe it or not, it can sneak up on you. But you can also take advantage to some extent of the fact that Rhino has very low scheme stats. So I'm going to actually choose to exhaust Mockingbird here in order to deal 1 damage to Rhino. Whether I'm thwarting or attacking, all Mockingbird could do is just 1. So I will lower his health dial here from 9 down to 8. Now, it's very important to keep in mind with your allies that when you trigger these actions, more often than not, you're going to see these little star icons beneath their basic actions. And for each icon, at the end of the ally's activation, after everything has been resolved, any potential responses or retaliates, we'll talk more about retaliate perhaps some other time, but when any of these other triggers are resolved, the final thing that will happen during a ally's activation is they will take consequential damage for the actions that they took, and you will deal them 1 damage for each of these icons. Now, some allies actually have multiple of these icons on 1 or more of their basic actions. So that's something to keep in mind as you're making those decisions. Is it worth it? But for the most part, most allies only take 1 consequential damage for each basic activation. So Mockingbird here just finished attacking Rhino. There is 1 star here. She will take 1 consequential damage, which we will represent through the use of this damage token here. So Mockingbird has taken 1 damage out of her potential 3 hit points. So we have to watch out for her health. She won't be here for much longer. We might get 1 more basic activation from her, and then potentially I could use her to defend an attack against Rhino or maybe another enemy. So now I have no more cards in my hand. I have only 1 action I could activate. I actually have this Tack Team, which I mentioned earlier. If I exhaust them and discard 1 token, I will be able to do 2 damage to an enemy. And I will lower this from 8 to 6. Now, whenever these cards, these upgrades or supports that have particular tokens representing the fact that there's only a limited pool of actions you can take with this card, whenever the final token is removed, you will place these cards in your discard pile. They are done until you draw them again on a future turn. So now I have no possible actions, no cards to play from my hand. All my abilities are exhausted except for Aunt May, but she's an alter ego action and I'm in hero form. Now we are once again done with the player phase, or actually we're about to be done with the player phase. Next thing is all the players would choose whether or not they wanted to discard any cards. I have no cards, so that's not an option. And then simultaneously, all the players will draw back to their hand size. Again, Spider-Man has a hand size of 5 cards. And then players would simultaneously ready all the cards in their player area. Now we're going to go for 1 more go around with the villain phase before we wrap up this video. So again, the first thing that happens during the villain phase is you place threat according to their acceleration rate, which here is only 1 per player. So I will add 1 more threat token on this main scheme. Then the villains would activate once per each player. We're playing a solo game, and they would activate according to the form that their identity card is currently on. If I were an alter ego, the villain would scheme. However, I am in hero form, so the villain will attack. Now, it tells us here with this stunned status card that the next time this character would attack, instead, we discard this card. So the villain will not attack me this time because he was stunned. So stun is a very useful status that you can impose on your enemy. And quite often, the enemies can impose it on the heroes as well. So that's something to keep in mind. So now he is done with his activation phase. If there were other players, they would not benefit from that stun status. That stun status is a 1 and done. So the next player, if they were in hero form, they would be attacked. So keep that in mind. Stun has greater value in a solo game than it does in a multiplayer game, but it's always very useful. Now that we're done with the villains activation, we are going to move on to the dealing of encounter cards. And again, you deal one face down card per player. The only exception to this one face down card per player is, as I mentioned earlier, every time you run through your deck, you will immediately be dealt a face down encounter card. Now, you would not reveal and resolve that card then and there. That card would stay there waiting for you until the beginning of or until the end of the villain phase during the encounter section of that phase. So this would be the time, if you had additional encounter cards, to reveal them one at a time and resolve them. However, that has not happened yet, so I will only reveal one card. But there are some other side schemes and cards that have a encounter icon, which every time while they are in play, what that indicates is that during the encounter part of the villain phase, after each player has drawn one card or drawn one face down card per player, you would draw one additional card, not one additional card per player, just one additional card in total, and that would be dealt to the first player. Now, if there were multiple of these encounter icons in play, then you would draw one additional encounter card per encounter icon to the additional players starting from the first player. So if there was two, for example, then the starting player and whoever was the second player would be dealt an additional encounter card. Again, that's not necessary right now. We just have one encounter card. I will reveal and resolve, and it's Explosion. This is a treachery type of card for the villain encounters. This is the equivalent of an event. It's something that's resolved once and for all, and then you move on. It says when revealed, and when revealed is an important text here, because sometimes cards are discarded, or sometimes they are they serve the purpose of being a boost card, but for them to be revealed, they need to come as an encounter card. And it says here that when this card is revealed, if a bomb scare is in play, if bomb scare is in play, and that is a scheme that's part of the bomb scare modular set, and it's not in play, if it were in play, we would assign X damage among heroes and allies, where X is the amount of threat on bomb scare. So you would count the amount of threat on the bomb scare side scheme if it were in play, and you would distribute that much damage among all the players and heroes according to how they decide. However, Bomb Scare is not in play, so instead, this card gains Surge, and Surge is another keyword you need to look out for. Every time a card says this card gains Surge, or it just says Surge, it means you will deal the top card of the encounter deck to that player, and they will reveal and resolve it. So basically, there's an additional card that I will draw. Sometimes cards that are like this, that are very situational, will have a surge condition if they're not able to resolve to their ultimate effect. And quite often, some really bad cards would still have an additional surge effect. And instead, I drew this Hydra Mercenary. He's a minion, pretty weak, but here's the thing, he's a guard. And this tells us right here what a guard is. It says that while this minion is engaged with you, you cannot attack the villain. So now I have this Hydra Mercenary engaged with me. And that's me, Spider-Man. If somebody else were playing with me, they are not engaged with the Hydra Mercenary, so they are not limited by him. But me, on the other hand, I cannot attack Rhino while I'm engaged with this player. So I have to eliminate this guy as quickly as I can in order to optimally be able to attack Rhino. Now, there are some loopholes around this. I mentioned earlier in the game that when the game refers to you, it refers to just your character and your hero. However, when it talks about this Hydra Mercenary, it has been clarified in future iterations of the rules that this applies to any card you control. So I wouldn't be able to use allies. I wouldn't be able to use anything or support cards in order to do that. Now, it does say specifically that I cannot attack Rhino. So other cards or other actions or other events that allow me to deal damage without the specific words attack are a loophole around the Hydra Mercenary. But you're not going to have as many of these actions as you would have attack actions. So again, you do want to get rid of him as quick as possible. But I would be able to use this tack team because again, the action here tells me I exhaust them, I remove one counter, and then I deal 2 damage without specifying that this is an attack. So this type of card would be a loophole around the guard cards for the time being. Now, there are some things that did not come up throughout the course of this playthrough video, and I would like to take a moment to briefly discuss these. So for starters, I mentioned earlier how we have boost cards that are revealed, and here on the bottom right-hand corner of these boost cards, of these encounter cards, is the very same encounter cards, we see these little arrow icons, and these arrow icons represent the boost icons. So whenever you're factoring a boost, you would modify the activation of the villain, whether it's their scheme stat or their attack stat, and you would add to their stat a number equal to the amount of these arrows that you reveal. And again, some cards have none, and you're very fortunate when you draw those. Quite often they have 1 or 2. Sometimes they even have 3 or as much as 4. You also have some special icons. They're like stars almost. None of the cards in this scenario have them, but they would be located somewhere next to these arrows, and they look basically like a star, and they're basically indicating that this card has a boost effect. That means other than just having a boost icon that will modify the particular activation of the villain, it also has an effect that will take place right then and there as the boost card is revealed. Before resolving that activation, you are going to take a brief moment to resolve whatever that boost effect might be. Now, another thing I want to discuss is these side schemes. So each villain has their main scheme, which consists of 1, 2, or even 3 stages. And that is basically the villain's end game or winning condition if they could advance their main scheme all the way through the final stage. However, within their encounter deck, you're going to find these different side schemes that are going to be shuffled in there, and you'll see this word here specifying that this is a side scheme. On the bottom here in this text box, you have this number 2, and that indicates that when this side scheme here, Bomb Scare, is put into play, it will be put into play somewhere in the villain area. You will place 2 threat tokens on this encounter immediately upon it entering play. Also, quite often, these encounters or these side schemes have a when revealed ability that gets resolved immediately. And more often than not, that when revealed ability involves placing additional threat here. So in the case of Bomb Scare, when this card is revealed, you place an additional 1 threat per player onto this card, and that's in addition to the 2 base value that this card will enter play with. So remember, I mentioned earlier, the when revealed is when this card is specifically being played from the encounter deck. Otherwise, it is not revealed. Quite often it's either discarded or it's a boost card, and then you do not resolve its when revealed effects. You would only resolve its boost icons and any other boost effect icons that might be printed on the card. So that's it as far as side schemes go. You also have attachment cards like this here. They usually are attached to the main villain or to a specific character, or sometimes just generically to a minion, and they'll usually have some type of temporary benefit or advantage for the villain as well. So these are the different card types that you will see. You have minions, which we already did come across those through the playthrough. So basically, you're going to keep on playing this game until the villain either goes through their main scheme and completes it to fruition, to its final stage, or till the villain knocks out all of the players by reducing them to 0 health. That's another way that the heroes can lose the game. But the heroes would win the game by first knocking out the villain, their first stage, or in the case of a expert game, their second stage. And after that, you would reveal their following stage. You would reset their hit dial according to their health, and usually the latter stages have a higher hit point value. And you would also resolve any when revealed effects when these latter stages of the villain cards are revealed. When you defeat the second stage of a villain, or in the case of an expert game, when you defeat their third stage, there's always going to be two stages. In the expert game, you're playing stages 2 and 3. In the standard game, you're playing stages 1 and 2. Once you've defeated the second of the two stages in the particular scenario, you have won the game. Now, another thing I wanted to mention are the special icons that sometimes occur on these side schemes. So for example, you have this here, which corresponds with the acceleration rate. And basically what this means is at the beginning of the villain phase, when you are adding threat to the scheme and you're factoring in the main scheme's acceleration rate, you're going to take this stat here on the main scheme and you're going to add or modify it +1 for each of these icons that might be in play. And in some occasions, you might have multiple side schemes that each have these icons, and you would add the total of each of these icons to this, and that would be the current acceleration rate. So in the case of, let's say, Bomb Scare being out as the only side scheme, it would add an additional 1 to the acceleration rate. So instead of adding just one threat to the main scheme at the beginning of the villain phase, now you are going to add 2. So when you see too many of these side schemes pop up, you are going to want to take care of them quickly. You also have different icons such as this. I did allude to this earlier. This is the additional encounter. This is referred to as the hazard icon. And for each of these icons that are in play, again, you can have multiple schemes having this icon. For each of these icons, you're going to draw an additional encounter. Keep in mind, it's not an additional encounter per player. It's just one additional encounter per icon. So if there are multiple players and there's only one icon, each player will get one encounter card, and the starting player will get one additional encounter card. And finally, the last icon that you need to keep in mind for the base game at least is this right here. And this is the crisis icon. And basically this icon means that while this side scheme is in play, until you defeat this side scheme, you cannot thwart and remove scheme or remove threat from the main scheme. That's not something you're going to be able to do. So you could remove threat from a side scheme, from another side scheme while this is in play, but you cannot interact with the threat on the main scheme in any sense or any form. So when you see these crisis icons, you want to resolve them as quickly as possible so that eventually you get to the point where you can deal with the main scheme again. And that's it as far as those different icons and some of the things that I think are important for a new player to know, but that did not come up and throughout the course of this playthrough. And that's pretty much it as far as how you play this game. I know that I went on a little bit too long perhaps and only covered 2 rounds and the setup, but I hope that it was useful. Please comment down below in the comment section if you have any additional questions as to how the game plays, if you have any confusion or misunderstandings about some of the rules that I discussed, or maybe some of the rules that I overlooked. I will be reading what you guys have to say. This is Harry saying take care everybody, stay safe, stay healthy, and have fun gaming. Bye-bye.